So thank you very much for coming. My name is Chiara De Luca. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Zurich and ETH Zurich, specifically within the Institute of Neuroinformatics. As you might guess, I am an academic person, so I'm not really used to these more tech-oriented conferences. That said, just please feel free to interrupt me if I'm going too fast, too slow, if it's not clear at all. Just don't wait until the end. Just stop me straight away. So I had the opportunity to talk with a lot of you in these days. And I realized that maybe I wanted to change the title and just get rid of all the useless things on that. And what I'd like to tell you is more about the brain-inspired neuromorphic intelligence. Now, usually interactions in these days where, what's your name, where you come from, what your talk is going to be about, I would answer like neuromorphic technologies, and the reply was kind of, what is that? What does it even mean? Some people faked that they actually knew that and were like, oh yes, of course, neuromorphic technologies, I like that thing. So what I'd like to convey in this talk is actually to try to answer to this question, that is, what does neuromorphic even mean? Now, the problem is that this is not an easy question, even among the people that actually work in neuromorphic technologies. You take 10 researchers in this field, ask the very same question to each one of us, and you're going to get a different feedback, a different answer from each one. This slide, I stole this slide from my boss, that is Giacomo Indiveri, and he has a very strong opinion about what neuromorphic should mean. He recently wrote an opinion paper about it. I strongly suggest to read it out. It's straightforward opinions, really well written, and so you could have his point of view on this topic next to mine. Just you could compare them if it doesn't feel right what I'm saying. Maybe his opinion would fit best for you. So this is my take for what neuromorphic technologies are. We want to take inspiration from the brain to develop some novel technologies to address some digital and societal challenges. So if we look at the first part of this statement, it's kind of fundamental science, right? We want to develop novel way to produce hardware. We want to think of a different way to do computation compared to standard computing approach. And this was the idea that the founders of this field had actually in mind. Here's the two people that actually invented neuromorphic. We are in the Caltech in the US, beginning of the 90s, and the man here is Carver Mead. He was a professor in electrical engineering. And next to him, there's Misha Mawald, and she was just a PhD student, a starting PhD student of biology. And these biologists, really young biologists, approached this super huge and important professor of engineering, suggesting to do a project together. And the idea was, let's take inspiration on how our retina in our eyes actually process the light to build a camera that instead of functioning as a standard camera, actually process the images in the same way that our eye does. So they started working together, putting together this interdisciplinary approach, and actually got the cover of the Scientific American paper. For any one of us that did a PhD, this is kind of a big thing. So what really motivated them at the beginning was this fundamental science approach, really just to understand how the brain works and try to get inspiration from that to build some smart, intelligent hardware. Now, in my statement, I added a second part that is this addressing digital and societal challenges. It's not just about thinking, understanding the brain and putting this principle in the hardware, but also doing that, keeping in mind some problems that standard computer can't actually address in the current society because of the limitations that real world poses us, because we don't have enough data set, because we want to stay low power, for any other reason, and try to really look into how the brain solves different tasks every day to try to address these challenges in the real world. Now, I'd like to tell you that this is what drives me to get into the field. I really wanted to do something practical to change the world, but reality is that this statement is the one that allows us to actually win the grants, getting money to keep working on our research. We need to show that we are actually doing something that is meaningful, or could be at least. Okay, so we can start from the very beginning. Let's make a step back and try to understand why are we so interested in the brain. So I suggest you to stop a moment and just think about how amazing the brain is and how an amazing machine is. Now you're staying here, you're listening to my talk. Maybe you get distracted, maybe you get bored. Maybe you might think of coffee break afterwards, what you're gonna eat. You are getting a lot of information, and you're combining all different information coming from different sensors with your previous knowledge about the world, what's happening now, and you're getting a coherent understanding of the situation. Now, you're doing that with an extremely low power consumption. This is the specifics of a bee brain. Now, I picked the bee that it's kind of a small animal, but it's not the easiest animal, right? It's not a worm. They have social interactions, they do work, the lifespan is pretty long. Indeed, they are pretty light, small. They don't have that many neurons, even if we want to compare to standard deep learning model. It's not that many neurons in the brain, and their energy consumption is extremely low. So one of the main features of the brain is its extremely low power. We do a lot of things every day, we function pretty well, and still we don't consume that much. We are also extremely noise resilient. The environment is changing, always changing. Our sensors are not perfect at all. And still, since we have this amazing capacity to integrate different signals, we are able to cut off all the noise and just take what's meaningful from the outside world for what we really want to do. The brain has a recurrent structure. This is a little bit more technical. But since I guess you are, or some of you might be accustomed to standard AI models. Usually the structure in AI is feed-forward. You have these different layers and the information flows in one direction. The brain, it's a mess. Everything is recurrent, all neurons are connected together. It's really hard to understand. Usually we talk about different areas like motor area, visual area, but in reality, everything is kind of connected. Neuroscientists don't even have a clue about how this is actually organized. But this is what allows us to have that low number of neurons. This is what really helps us to keep the brain small enough compared to standard deep learning models. Our brain is always on. We are always doing something. It's always processing something. When we go to sleep, it's not like the brain is not doing anything. The brain is still readjusting the memories, is recovering, is processing data. It's not like we get turned on and off. It's always there. And it is plastic. We are able to generalize, meaning that we can change, and we do continually change the structure of the brain depending on new stuff that we learn or new changing that we have in the environment. And this is crucial. And this is strongly related to adaptability. If any one of you at some point broke a bone and you had to put, this really heavy stuff on your arm that was broken, and you had to learn to walk with this different weight and different asymmetric dynamics in the brain, and that is pretty easy to do, right? It's not like that if we change our weight distribution, we have huge issues in adjusting to that changing in the environment. And this is crucial to live in the world that we live in, because this is a changing environment and we need to be adaptable. And finally, we are attentive. We are surrounded by inputs, and we have this amazing capability to really understand which are the important things now. I'm talking, you might be listening to you, but if at some point the fire alarm would start ringing, then you would definitely stop thinking at me, listening to me, and just start thinking about the firing alarm. I'm pretty sure most of you are going to have trousers on right now, and I'm pretty sure that you don't feel the feeling of the trousers on your legs, But now that I told you, you might start thinking about how weird it is to actually realize that you have stuff on your body and your brain is just cutting it out. It's super impressive how we have this ability to really identify what's important to pay attention to. So this is just an overview of why we are so much interested into the brain, and what we'd like to do is to take inspiration from some of the features of the brain to see how we solve these issues and put these concepts in the hardware. So let's try to make a comparison between our biological brain and the standard von Neumann architecture, computing architecture. Now, our brain is asynchronous. We don't have a clock, okay? The standard von Neumann architecture have a clock. We have a sampling rate. This can be super high, but in the brain, this is not like that. We just have continuous inputs. We don't have sampling rates, with some small exception, but it's not interesting to go into this. Another principle is that memory and computing are co-localized. Now, we don't have a RAM in the brain. It's not like we have a computing unit and a memory unit and we go back and forward as we do in standard computing architecture. This is extremely time-consuming. In our brain, the hardware is the algorithm. Memory is encoded in the structure of neurons and network and in their dynamics. We don't have this separation, and this is pretty interesting for low latency and low power consumption and capabilities. Then we are fast learners compared to standard AI models that are pretty slow learners. We need not that many examples in our life to be able to master something, and we are super adaptable. We can learn to drive a bike. We can take some time to learn how to drive a bike when we're a child. And then, I don't know, I went to the Netherlands, and out of the blue, I found out that I had no brakes on my bike, and I had to stop and to brake, just moving my feet the other way around. This was something that I'd never been exposed before, and still, with just few trials, I was able to adapt to that. We are pretty fast. The computer, not that much, right? We need a lot of data. And then if we change one small detail, it can be quite hard for even the modern deep learning algorithm to generalize. Finally, the brain is always on. I mentioned it before. In standard deep learning mechanisms, we usually have a training phase that is separated from the inference phase. So we need to have this huge separation. Now, this comparison is, of course, on average. It's not like deep learning is fixed and it's just one thing. We do have algorithm of deep learning that can try to integrate some of these principles in this algorithm. But overall, these are the concepts over which the von Neumann architecture were actually built on. And that's why we want to try to change them. And the idea is that we want to take inspiration from the brain to develop these novel technologies, to develop this new way to perform computation. So on one hand, we have that neuroscience that guides engineering. On the other, I need to mention it, even if I'm not going to talk about it, but please come and talk to me if you're interested. We can also have the other way around. Sometimes our novel technology actually can inspire some new neuroscience perspectives. And this is one of the circuits that we built in our chips. No need to go into detail. This is a neuron. So in these circuits, just of a CMOS circuits made of transistors and few capacitors, we are actually able to emulate the dynamic of biological neurons. Now, the interesting part about it is that this is not a simulation, okay? It's not like we are numerically simulating this really non-linear dynamics of biological neurons. Everything is intrinsic to the physics. Biological neurons work like that. They get an input, they get charged. If they stop getting any input, they decharge with an exponential decay. If they get enough input and cross the threshold, then they're gonna emit a spike. The neurons are strongly analog. The communication between neurons is strongly digital. And it makes sense, right? We do all know that communicating through a digital is way more efficient and noise resilient than just sending an analog information through a network. Now, As I mentioned, we don't have a RAM in our brain, and we don't have a RAM in our neuromorphic chips, meaning that we need to structure the memory we need to encode the memory in the structure of the network itself. Biological neurons have a time scale of 20 milliseconds up to 200 milliseconds. It's really hard to find longer time scales in biological brain. This means that the neuron is actually able to know whether an input came before or not only within a time span of maximum 200 milliseconds. If you think about the time scales of the signals that we usually process in the real world, this is really short time. Usually things evolve on way slower time scales, meaning that encoding that in the memory of the neuron is not enough for our brain. Everything needs to be encoded in the structure itself. This is convenient for us because, in CMOS, we could build neurons that have way longer memory. Why don't we want to do that? It's not just because we want to do something similar to the brain, but it's pretty convenient because to have longer time scales, we would need bigger capacitors. Bigger capacitors means more area. More area in an analog chip means more money to print it, and we don't want to have extremely expensive chips. So we really need to address the same challenges that the brain has. Our neurons have a time scale of tens, hundreds of milliseconds, and we need to find different ways to actually being able to record and to process data that evolve on slower time scales. We have the neurons. A typical size of the chip has 200, 1,000 neurons, no more. But again, compared to standard AI, it's pretty low number of neurons. We can connect them in either a smart or not so smart way to try to perform computation. And here are some plots of the chips that we actually work on. I'm sorry, the comparison is with 10 Swiss franc cents, that I know it's not the most common coin, but it's not so different than the 10 cents in euros, just to provide a size definition. Okay, let's move on and try to see the thing that interests me the most, actually, that it's about what are the challenges. Why is it interesting to do this kind of approach? Why do we need to take, actually, this whole, bother us, try to understand neuroscience, interact with neuroscientists to really build something that is non-standard computational approach? And the idea is that we want to address the real-world challenges, taking into account what's the need of a specific application, build our hardware in order to match these needs, and keep this circle of co-design in which the challenge and the hardware talks together to kind of perform an ASIC approach. And here are some examples of typical applications that we have. One hand in the bottom, we have the prosthetic devices. People that maybe lost their arm or the leg, what we can do is to put a chip just close to the end of the arm, for example, monitor the signal from muscles, understand what this signal is encoding. So that's the brain saying something like, okay, close your hand, grasp the bottle, and you can actually decode this from the activity of the muscles in a local manner and control a prosthetic device. So through the brain, the person can actually perform this actuation. Now, there are some issues here, right? On one hand, we want to stay low power, because if we have a chip next to the arm, we don't want to charge it every other hour. And the actuator of the prosthetic device is expensive enough. We don't want to put a huge computer and super consuming computer. Second part, we don't want to use the cloud. This is sensible data. There are privacy issues. We want to have everything happening locally. We don't want to send this information everywhere with all the security problems connected to this. Third part, this problem is not generalizable at all. Every person has a different way to encode the signal in the muscles. It's not like I train a network to identify what your signals are encoding in a specific scenario, and then I deploy the chip on a different person, and the chip is going to work the same way. Not at all. It's really personal. So we want to have a chip that maybe could start from, a nice scenario which kind of is able to decode this information, but we want a chip that is actually to continuously adapt and change to overfit on the specific user that actually needs to tackle this challenge. And this is one of the use case that we have it the most, because it's pretty peculiar. It's not solvable with a standard artificial intelligence application. We need to do something more. And taking inspiration from the brain is actually a nice idea and something that is bringing some nice results about it. Another field is precision farming. You have a field, you want to optimize the water consumption, or maybe you want to optimize your pest detection. You can't bring power supply everywhere in the field. You want something small, you want something that might be charged from a solar panel. Just put the sensor there, let the chip perform the computation, and just being alerted when some pests are detected, for example, or control the water supply setups. Another approach might be biomedical signal processing. We want to always control our systems to check what's our status. Now, most of us are going to have a smartwatch. And this is doing the thing, right? And this is not neuromorphic. Why is it really needed? Well, smartwatch needs to be charged every other day. That is perfect if I just want to track my runs with that. But if you're a patient with dementia, for example, or if you want to do something a little bit more than just monitoring the heart rate, but for example, detect when something is wrong in your heartbeat, if you're having a seizure, then you need to stay a little bit lower power. You might want to have something that is a little bit smaller. You might want to avoid sending data via Bluetooth to your phone every other moment. So this is also a direction in which these kind of technologies could be of interest. And finally, it's robotic approaches. Now, moving a robot, it's pretty hard. And it's hard to address this issue with standard AI. And if you have a really complex robot, that maybe we don't want to go with the neuromorphic technologies because we don't have enough computational power to address it. But for some specific scenarios, neuromorphic technologies might be needed. Let's think, for example, of an underwater robot. In an underwater robotic, you need to stay light because you want your robotic fish to actually be able to move in the water. You can't put a lot of batteries on top of it, so you really need low power. And you can't transmit anything, because underwater transmission is awful. So every computation needs to be local. And that's, for example, an approach in which our chips are actually needed. Now, all these approaches are kind of on-the-edge intelligence, meaning that the whole point is to have a chip that is put there and performs computation without transmitting data. Everything needs to be local, and all these applications behave like that. Now, I'm not going to go in detail about it, but this is our Santa Claus request from the processing data on the edge. And again, I would like you to focus on the adaptability and reliability of the systems. We want to have a chip that is put next to the user, next to the problem, and is able to address the changes of the environment. We are not behaving in an environment that was made for the chip. We are behaving in a real environment with all the changes in temperature and humidity and position of the chips and eventually animals interacting with the chip. And you want the chip to actually be able to respond and to adapt to this environment in a reliable way. And here are some examples. We want the system to be able to adapt to system failures. If something breaks, we would like to have the system to keep adjusting itself. We want it to have it optimized over the final user as in the prosthetic control device, and we want to adapt to environmental changes, and this is particularly needed for precision farming application, in which temperature changes, rain, and everything else could be really a challenge for some of the tasks. Now, I'm not going to go in detail of this task, but I would like to provide you an overview of different approaches that we are actually done. I already mentioned this about health monitoring use case. This is about heart rate and agitation states. This work is mainly led by Elisa Donati, that is a professor at our institute. She's also in charge of the prosthetic device line of research. And here we have the goal is to monitor the state of elderly patients through a small easy-to-use device that is actually able to detect whenever an agitation state in dementia is happening. Now, to do that, it's not enough to really monitor one signal. It's crucial to have a sensor fusion. It's not enough to look at the heart rate. We need to look at all different informations and actually combine them. Taking inspiration from the brain is actually a nice way to approach this issue. Another health biomedical signal processing approach concerns the seizure detection. And we do this in collaboration with the Hospital of Zurich, University Hospital of Zurich. Epileptic patients, you want to monitor the EEG from a scalp, so you want to have something on your head that is actually able to always on monitoring your EEG and predict when a seizure is about to happen, so that you know and you can sit down or relax or ask for help before this might occur. And the idea here is that we want something that is reliable, but we don't need high accuracy. It's not like we want to be perfect in predictions. We want to avoid the false negatives. If sometimes we have some false positive, that's not a big deal, right? But if we can stay light and small and actually be reliable on predicting when a seizure is about to happen, that's something that is actually could be actually of interest. And then we are exploiting that direction to really try to address this topic. Moving on to the precision farming use case, I'm sorry, I needed to put some numbers here just because it's my job. Here we were trying to address the issue of smart irrigation optimization. We did this in collaboration with the Politecnico di Torino. And the idea, we had apple orchards. We want to optimize the water supply. They did these experiments, standard computing, in which they compared a smart irrigation system with the one of an expert, of the farmer. And they found out that through an automatic irrigation, like a smart one, you could actually save a lot of water. The problem is that, yes, this is environmental friendly, but they were consuming a lot of power. And you know, that's a tight, not so easy challenge to address. So what we tried was to develop a neuromorphic-like approach to substitute the chip that they actually developed to do this smart irrigation so that we could lower the power consumption. We managed to get it lower by 10 times. We could go lower eventually with an ASIC. This was a general purpose chip. But still, this is a direction that it's quite of interest, right? Water supply might look something easy to deal with, but again, if we really take into account all the challenges of the real-world setups, changing temperatures, the cost of the chip itself, to make it worth for the farmer to be used, this is not so easy as a task. And neuromorphic approach might be the solution to these kind of tools. Another project I actually personally really like is this beehive monitoring. Again, we want to continuously monitor the health of the queen bee and of the hive in general, and we are approaching this problem through an audio processing. And we take inspiration on how our cochlea, how our ear are actually working to really have an audio processing that is light enough to be processed on the edge and not need to go remotely, and is actually low power enough that we don't need to charge the battery every other day or bring the power supply to the beehives themselves. Moving to the robotic control use case. This, I don't know if it's gonna start. I mean, this is completely different use case. I mentioned the underwater robot, but I really wanted to show this work made in collaboration with the lab from Chiara Bartolozzi in Genova. Now, the goal was to have a robot that was actually able to play a rocky. Now, a rocky, it's a challenge one, because it's super fast. And here, this is not about power supply, right? We can have the whole robotic setup, we can put whatever power consumption there, and it's not going to be an issue at all. But standard computing methods kind of fail to address this problem. And the problem is that this is too fast. And the latency comes into play here. It can be pretty hard to address this challenge. And we could solve it, kind of. We are solving it with a neuromorphic approach to really address this always on asynchronous processing of data. Through this idea of not having a clock, but actually being able to select the information whenever they come and whenever they change and whenever they are interesting for the field, actually allows us to have a fast response and a fast control of the motor of the robotic platform, and actually being able to kind of play of a match in this scenario. Now, of course, this is a work in progress. So right now we don't have, the fully robot versus human match that is actually in place. We need to go a little bit slower than usual. But still, we are moving towards, and there's Irene that is doing an amazing PhD job trying to address this challenge. So let's try to sum it up a little bit. The general idea of this field is to take inspiration from the brain to address some challenges, to develop novel technologies to address some challenges. And this is because compared to the standard computing, our brain has some really nice properties and features that we might need to exploit for specific real-world constraints. In order to do that, we really need to understand neuroscience. We really need to take inspiration from neuroscience. And this could be of a challenge sometimes. We are able to build some biologically like neurons in our chips. I showed you the CMOS implementation of these neurons. This could be done also with novel materials, like biodegradable materials or fancier ones. But still, the idea and the challenge is once you have the neurons to connect them in a reliable way that is actually able to perform computation, irrespectively to all the limitations that we have in an analog hardware, in an analog substrate. And this allows us to tackle some of the challenges that we want to have, mainly addressing the problems of power supply and low latency and adaptability to the changes in the environment. This is the general approach that we have in neuromorphic technologies. There's a lot to be done, a lot to be understood, also from the brain perspective. We have the privilege to work in an academia environment, so we can try to explore a little bit more, challenging and where the outcome is not really known. But the direction and the future direction of this field is really to try to get a connection with the industry partner. It's really to try to understand whether this kind of approach could actually be useful for a real-world deployment to move a little bit more from the academia to a real-world production. So this is one of the pictures of the lab. Not everyone is there, but of course, I'd like to thank you for the attention and all the partners that support this research. Thanks. Yeah.
You showed us the model of a neuron that you did.
Yeah.
Can you compare that when we're speaking about power consumption?
Yes.
To the actual neuron
in the brain. Yeah.
100 times more? Does it mean 1,000?
It's.
What's basically the scale?
Yeah, I need to. Yes. It's a really interesting question. It really depends on what neurons we are trying to address. So I could say hundreds, thinking of really smart, complex neurons that are recorded in the higher parts of the cortex. It can be 1,000 if you actually look at the most widespread kind of neurons. This is a simplification. This is not one-to-one emulation of the neurons in the brain. We have different kinds of neurons, but this is kind of the average neuron type. All the other details are not really useful, and since we really want to have something that works in the end, we try to include only the features that are actually useful for us to perform the computation. So the chips are consuming way more than the brain.
Plus, they're not really doing all those stuff, actual neurons.
Exactly. But compared to standard computing application, I'm not talking about GPUs or computers, just compared to a RISC-V application or microcontroller, we are saving a lot. So we're kind of staying in the middle. But yes, of course.
I just wanted to know how far can we go with that?
No, I mean, I'm pretty sure this is CMOS. I'm pretty sure that addressing some smart, novel technologies for developing the hardware, like biodegradable stuff, polymeric, all this kind of information, we could actually tackle it a little bit and go a little bit lower. But then it becomes harder to produce them, and that's a whole line of research. Interesting to go to. I'm not an expert about it.
1,000 times more isn't that much.
No.
It's still.
No, but that's I mean, yeah, that's challenging to measure as well. Yeah.
Thank you.
You showed a game at the end.
Yes.
What kind of reaction time do you need to have to be able to play the game?
Haha. I don't really remember that number, but I do remember it's. If we're talking about humans playing the game, then it can be pretty fast. But I'm afraid I'm scared of saying a number because it might not need it. I do not remember that.
I was mostly interested in comparing it to an actual MCU or something.
Okay. No, I don't remember the exact numbers, but we started this collaboration with a lab from Chiara. She did a lot of work within the neuromorphic environment, but they first tried to address it with standard computing, try to reduce the latency, trying with FPGAs, and they couldn't really tackle the problem. They could control efficiency, the robot, getting to the pack and actually start the game, but when it comes to a reaction, it can be slow. Also because it's slow to identify the position of the pack in order to understand what to do. That's the hardest part, and that's the part in which neuromorphic technologies, let's say an evolution of the retina model of the first neuromorphic founders, is actually helping a lot to really reduce the latency of the system itself.
The seizure detection.
Yes.
What was the input there? Was the input only EEG?
That is a scalp EEG. I'm not sure how familiar you could be with these technologies, but there's different ways to measure the activity of the brain. Of course, the most precise ones are just putting electrodes in the brain. That's quite invasive. You could have kind of scalp EEG. It's just external, and it's like a cup. Pretty efficient, but not so comfortable. And nowadays you have these small sensors that are kind of patches this side that you could put in precise positions around the head. And this is pretty easier to implement, right? Because you could just fix them under the hair. It's not really invasive, not really uncomfortable. And that was the signal. It can be pretty noisy, but I have to say that seizures are pretty strong. It's pretty easy to detect when a seizure is occurring in the brain. Predicting it could be a little bit more challenging, but if it goes to few seconds before, just providing the time frame to stop or ask for help, then you can start. It's not that hard of a task. The difficulties here are to have a system that is actually able to process this all time, always on, online, on time, without huge power consumption or huge dimensions.
Since dogs can be trained to do it as well, and
yes,
not invasive.
I know, but yes, I totally agree with that. It gets harder in different countries to have access to the dogs and these kind of things, but Sweden is amazing for that. Yeah.
So I'm super curious. Here you show the seizure detection case.
Yep.
You're talking about the encoder component here, including into a neuromorphic chip. How do you then turn that into a
Yeah, thank you for noticing it, because I was really hoping about it. Now, I focused on the encoder because this is the work that's been done by Filippo Costa that recently got a PhD in our lab. And that's because, as I mentioned, and as you know better than me, neurons communicate through digital inputs. So whenever we have this on the edge computing, we have the signal from the sensor that typically is an analog signal. EEG are analog signals. You want to convert them to being provided as an input to the neuron so that it can be processed. Now, everything on the chip, everything here for the seizure detection is happening on the chip. The problem is that the hardest part was this conversion, converting the analog to spike signal as an incoming to the neural network to perform the seizure detection. The seizure detection afterwards is done with a reservoir computing standard. We have a bunch of neurons connected together, and we train the readout in order to just detect whether the activity is a seizure or not. But the doing the encoding part in the smart way actually allowed us to reduce a lot the dimensionality of the network, because it actually extracted the feature from the encoder part. So that was the most challenging part, and that's why I tried to sneak it in the slides. I really like the work from Filippo, and I think it was worth mentioning it. Yeah, thanks for noticing a lot. Okay, I guess it's done. Thank you very much for your attention.